Yep, still
Hello.
here.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I just wanted
Hi.
to say hi. Hi. I'm sorry I
Hello,
couldn't come
Christina.
earlier. How are you? How is
We're good.
everything?
We're good. But I think we'll
Yeah.
be live live soon.
Okay. So I just want to say I love you guys. Sorry for not being here before. Just wanted to say hi. Bye.
No worries.
Bye,
Thank you, Christina.
Christina.
Bye.
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 I think we're live, everyone. So good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's 8 p.m. in Manila and Singapore, 9 a.m. in California. It's an ungodly 4 a.m. in Brazil, and about almost 11:30 in Australia.
11.
So
Yes.
before we start, we want to thank the organizers of FutureCon and Future Talks for inviting us all. And we're here tonight for Future Currents, Philippines and Singapore. And with me are three amazing writers and friends. We have Isabel Yap, who is currently needing coffee in the United States. You've got Eliza Victoria, who is in Australia, possibly needing coffee very soon. And Vida Cruz, who is in Manila at the same time as I am. If you drink coffee, you won't be able to sleep tonight. So
I know, right?
yeah. So myself, I'm Victor Fernando Ocampo. I'm in Singapore, and like I said, this is FutureCon's Philippines and Singapore Future Currents. So what we will do is in reverse order. Well, starting with Vida, give a short introduction about yourself, your work, and at the end of it, tell us how you got started in speculative fiction.
Okay, then. Hi, my name is Vida Cruz. I am a writer, an artist, and a book editor. My fiction you can read on Strange Horizons, Expanded Horizons, the Philippine speculative fiction series of anthologies, and other anthos. I've attended Clarion UCSD in 2014. I have also been a Tip 3 slash otherwise fellow, and my fiction has been nominated for the British Science Fiction Awards. Um, I'm a book editor with The Darling Axe, and I specialize in fantasy and science fiction. So if you're just coming off NaNoWriMo and you have a book that you'd like to have line edited or need developmental edits, totally open for queries. I don't bite. Um, what else? It's raining here in Manila. I have 10 dogs who are sheltering from the rain. Um, what else is there? How did I get started? Speculative fiction. I think most people my age will say Harry Potter, but if you mean writing speculative fiction, I read a story in this anthology edited by Ellen Datlow and Terry Woodling, which is called Fairy Reel Tales of the Twilight Realm. And I loved it. It's one of my favorites ever. But there's a story there called In the Night Market by Holly Black. And she said it in the Philippines. It had Filipino characters. And at first I was like, oh, how cool. But also I was like, I think I can do better than that. And maybe that's hubris when you read that story at the age of 18. But I guess you could say that's how it started. And if you mean specifically how did I get started in science fiction, this anthology, edited by Jeff Vandermeer and Anne Vandermeer, was really good at showing me that science fiction is not just about colonizing other planets in space, it's also about social issues, and they're not necessarily techie. I highly recommend it. It's really nice. And let's move on to somebody else.
Yeah, let's go to Eliza. Eliza, introduce yourself and also say how you started in speculative fiction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eliza Victoria, and I'm a writer of speculative fiction. You can go to elizavictoria.com to see a list of my publications. There are also links there if you want to read free fiction that are available online now. Um, I I volunteered for this question, didn't I? And now my brain is not working. Anyway, I am currently based in Sydney. It's 11 p.m. on a Sunday. I have work tomorrow. So if I don't make sense, that's why. But to answer to answer the question, I'm thinking specifically about how I got into science fiction. Growing up, I read a lot of horror. That's always been my first love. So I read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, Shirley Jackson, Stephen King. When I think of science fiction, when I think of the genre, I always think that because I watched a lot of Hollywood movies, I thought that science fiction had to be loud, like specifically Hollywood loud. So I'll think Jurassic Park, Alien, Star Wars. And then I found secondhand copies of Asimov's science fiction magazine. When I read those stories, that's when I realized that these are quiet science fiction stories. They're introspective, and I was I write stories like that. I can write science fiction. So it's like an epiphany for a high schooler me. Yeah, so that's how I got started when I thought I can write this. I can write a science fiction story with just two characters talking. And that could fit the genre. I didn't know I didn't know that that can happen. I thought you need to have like car chases and loud explosions. So yeah.
And how did you start?
How I started writing?
Yes.
I've always been, because I grew up in a household where the supernatural is accepted as real, like it's not separate from real life. Like I grew up hearing stories about, like my mother would say we had a neighbor who's a witch, and she would say it really like matter of fact, your uncle once saw a mermaid. So these stories I just accepted as part of reality. So when I wrote my stories, I didn't think of like that sharp demarcation between realist fiction, speculative fiction. They're all just part of my life. So yeah, and then I think growing up, that's when I found out that that's how you label those stories. But in my mind, they're stories.
Isabel, your turn.
Yeah, I love that answer about the supernatural is real. I think that's like very particular. I mean, a lot of cultures have it, but it is such a Filipino thing.
Yeah.
And we could talk about this more later. But when
Yeah.
I was at Clarion, I asked my class how many people here believe in ghosts, and there were only 2 of us in a room of 19 people, which was really shocking to me because these are speculative fiction writers, right?
Yeah.
Um, I am in California, and it's actually 4 a.m. here. We're the earlier time, I think. So I am what they call bagong gising in Tagalog, which is like you just woke up and you're like, I don't really know what's happening. But really, really excited to be able to do this panel. Quick intro. I am Isabel Yap, or Isa. I write fiction and poetry. By day, I'm a product manager. So I work in the tech industry. I grew up in the Philippines, and I grew up in Quezon City. I went there for 2 years of undergrad, and then I moved to the States in 2010. So that was already a whole decade ago, which is really mind-boggling to me. And I attended Clarion in 2013. I started publishing in 2008 outside of school literary folios. I actually have my very first publication on my desk because I keep some of the books there, and I have a story that ties to Eliza's, but this is the first volume I was ever published in. And then
Fantastic.
yeah, then post Clarion, I submitted work to some publications abroad, so that I guess was a little bit of a shift for me too. And yeah, have been writing and publishing spec fic since 2008, but I actually started writing prose, in particular fan fiction, in 1998. So been at writing for a long time. And writing fanfic, I would say, is kind of maybe where I'd say I started writing science fiction, because I was really into like anime and JRPGs, and they don't differentiate between science fiction and fantasy in a lot of cases. So I was in Final Fantasy VII fandom for a long time, for example. And that's just like, they have like ships and weird weapons. They have a fake cell phone called PHS. Like, it's science fiction, but then they also have magic spells. They also have mages, right? So I grew up with the sensibility that you don't really need to differentiate, because that's much more the Japanese tradition of speculative, I guess. But to tie it back to Eliza's story, Eliza,
It's fine.
either's
They
fine.
can't, for some
Yeah,
reason.
sorry, I keep saying that.
No, it's fine.
Eliza from now on.
Yeah, that's how my mother
You know,
pronounced
you
it.
corrected me already before.
But
Eliza.
the thing is,
I'm sorry.
it's fine. But this is here in Sydney, they can't pronounce it. Like, I'll tell them it's Eliza, and then they'll just say Eliza. Then I got tired of correcting people, so now I just sure,
Yeah.
it's fine.
I did the same thing with Isa and Isabel when I moved to the
Yeah.
States, because they can't really say Isa, some
Yes.
people. So now I go by Isabel.
Yeah.
When the story that I published in PSF4 was a fantasy story, but when I was reading the book of them, and it's got like, it's so cute. It's got the signatures of all the people who were there during the book launch.
Wow.
Aww.
I read Eliza's story, which was called Parallel, and it was about, a brother who goes back in time to see his sister who's passed away. Spoilers.
Yeah.
Spoilers-ish. And it was a quiet spec fic story.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, it's a quiet sci-fi story. And I want to write something like that, where there's a science fictional element, but the emotions are really the centerpiece. So the next year, when they had another open call for submissions for PSF5, that's exactly what I tried to do. And I wrote a story called Sync, about a robot boy and his mom. So it was really Eliza's story that sort of like made me want to try writing sci-fi, like a brand, I guess, of Filipino sci-fi.
Aw.
Yeah.
That's
True story.
Connections.
Okay, pass on to Victor.
Okay, now it's me. My name is Victor Fernando Ocampo. I am Filipino, but I've been living in Singapore for the last 20 years. I have a bit of identity crisis. I started writing in the Philippines. I started writing in grade school. But unfortunately, when I did, it was the time when the only thing that people wanted to publish was socially relevant or realist stories.
Yes.
So even as a grade schooler, when I submitted something with a rocket ship or a ghost or something like that, it always got rejected. So this happened all the way to university, and because I was also into photography, I ended up doing photography instead of writing. I never submitted my writing. I put it all collected in a hard drive somewhere. And that was before, and so you know my age, this was before PSF. So there was no opportunity to publish any of these. And essentially, I left, I moved to Singapore. And that's actually when people started accepting my stories. My wife secretly sent off a story of mine in PSF 6, the issue after what you the one that you just showed, Isa. And unknown to me, Nikki and Kate Osias, Nikki Alfar, accepted the story. And it was like, my wife told me, hey, look, you've got an acceptance. And I go, how? I never sent anything. So lesson learned, do not give your partner's email access, your password. They might
I
publish your
see.
story for you.
I think she did a good thing though.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
did. And that started my publishing history. But although the bulk of my stories are about Filipinos, I have a bit of an identity crisis living here so long. It's already infiltrated my work. About roughly half my stories are actually Singaporean in some way, even if the protagonist is Filipino. So that's something that we can explore further when we talk about diaspora. how did I start writing spec fic and science fiction? Well, actually, my grandfather had a library in his house. It's a small library, but he had lots and lots of books because he used to be a bookseller.
Ooh.
So he,
That's cool.
yeah, when he passed away, he left that library to me. And my favorite books were about this guy that I always thought was a science fiction author because there's a collection of his short stories. His name was E.M. Forster. And
Oh.
all of it, yeah, all
Huh.
of it was science fiction and speculative fiction. And then, when I was a little older, I was watching Howard's End with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and I was going, "Why? That sounds just like the speculative fiction writer that I liked to read as a kid." I had no idea that E.M. Forster was actually writing something other than science fiction,
Mm.
which is probably a very weird thing. But I still have that book with me, and if you ever find it, he has one story called "The Machine Stops," which is eerily like our pandemic situation right now, where we're all
Ooh.
talking online like this instead of seated in some room talking. So that's how I started. I thought I could write those kinds of things too, but unfortunately, no one would accept them for the longest time. Thankfully, much later on, somebody did, and here we are. Yeah. So, enough about me. Vida showed off her dog. I have a companion here too. There. Anyway.
Aw.
What?
Anyway,
What?
yes, this is Frankie, my dog.
I'm sorry. What did you?
No, no, I said you showed off your dog. I don't know who that was, but it's not Kobe. Yeah, Frieza's freezing at the moment.
Yeah.
But anyway, moving on.
Oh.
One of this talk is specifically. Sorry, Vida. I think
Oh.
your copy.
Well, she showed off herself. She suddenly entered.
Oh,
Hold on a sec.
no worries. Anyway, while you're fixing, I'll just say one of the things that why I find this particular panel important is because we would like to introduce Filipino science fiction um, to everybody else. As you heard from people we were talking to before the panel started, a lot of science fiction comes from us. We've been writing since 1946. It's at over 70 years of writing science fiction, and even longer if you take general speculative fiction. Yet very few people actually know about the kind of writing that we have. So one of the things that we need to tell people is there anything very specific about Filipino science fiction? Is there any issue that we have that Filipinos like to talk about or need to talk about to the world? So uh,
I
let's go in reverse order this time. Isabel, you first.
Issues that we need to talk about as
Also
Filipinos.
characteristics of Filipino science fiction or speculative fiction.
I really want to hear about what were being published in the 40s, 50s onwards, Victor, because I think
You Mm.
my experience of Filipino spec fic is like what you described, where outside of PSF, there really wasn't much, and you can see it in what's taught in high school, right? For example, it's all
Yes.
realism. It's the same thing that they're teaching in college. When we had in second year in my school, second year high school, you had to pick a Filipino book for your book report, Filipino book published in English. And people were choosing NVM Gonzalez and like all of these other authors. See, I can't even, I'm like blanking. Who was it besides NVM Gonzalez? Not Nick Wakin. Although
Carla
Nick Wakin,
Passes.
huh?
Carla Passes.
Gregorio Brillantes?
Yeah,
Gregorio
yeah.
Brillantes.
Yeah, but it was
Nick Wakin.
all these sad realism stories. That was really the focus. So when I think about what do Filipino spec fic authors write about, it is this group, right? Or people who are writing in places like PSF, or there's another anthology, Diaspora and Astra,
Yes.
edited by Joey Nacino and Dean Alfar, which specifically is about, talk about diaspora as a Filipino.
I
And
think
it
it's
has to be
Professor
science.
Emil Flores who was the
Emil
editor.
Flores.
Oh,
Yeah.
Emil Flores.
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, is that a story?
No, no,
No,
one of
editor.
the editors. Yeah,
Ah, you're
I think
right.
I
Joseph.
have it.
Emil Flores and Joey Nacino. I
Yeah.
actually also have it on my desk.
I
There
have
you
that
go.
too.
I should
Somewhere
have
here.
just checked. These volumes are so precious because like it's
Yeah.
so hard to get a hard copy. You know, I go to
Yeah.
National Bookstore and hunt for them. There was a period
I
of
do
like a
too.
decade where I kept trying to find it. Yeah, sorry.
I was
I
thinking of
love your
that,
story there.
but for
I love your
later.
story there.
um so I think for me my answer to that would be our concerns in the speculative fiction mode are the same concerns Filipinos would have generally. And it's hard not to talk about like society, and how our society is fractured and how so many people have to go abroad in order to keep their families afloat. I think violence in whatever form, but like I was thinking about it the other day, and I was like, to be Filipino is to be exposed to violence, in all kinds of forms in the news, um, and we experienced this recently with the recent storms, right? Like,
Mm.
there was this line of, let's stop saying that Filipinos are resilient. I
Yeah.
mean, we are, but we're also drowning. And I think about that, like I think we all have this myth of like there's endless suffering, but that's okay. Let's just dance and pray. Um, and it's like, actually, no, like some of these things are really bad. And so I think when I read the spec fic of our authors, it is engaged with and concerned with whether it's like a space opera or recent, near future or whatever it is. Like it's engaged with these same themes that would be present in any other type of spec fic story. There's always a bit of horror and there's always a bit of magic too, I think, threaded into our science fiction.
That's right. Yeah. Speaking of magic and horror, uh, Eliza, that is something that is also a hallmark, particularly of your fiction. What do you think are the characteristics of Filipino science fiction and the issues? Same question.
Yeah. Well, I think Isa was able to cover a lot
Yes,
of
she
it.
did.
Um, and yeah, like it's funny because Victor, you were talking about writing speculative fiction before it became, in vogue, sort of, and you're not getting accepted because everyone wants the social realist kind of story. But the thing is, our science fiction is still very much rooted in our
Oh
reality.
yes.
It's
Yeah.
still it's still social realist with robots, basically. so we mentioned Gregorio Brillantes earlier. He wrote this amazing science fiction story that I love until now, the Apollo Centennial,
Apollo
which was
Centennial, yes.
which was published late 70s, I think.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. But most people can look for the anthology published in 1981.
Oh yeah, there you
Yeah.
go. Yep. And that
Which is hard to
actually,
find.
sorry, Vida,
No, it's hard to find. I actually got a copy of
there
his
you go.
collection in UP Press, but now I can't even go there. So if any of you want a copy of that story, I actually sent it to Jeff Vandermeer for evaluation for the big book of classic science fiction. It
Yeah.
didn't get in, but
Oh.
I still have the hard copy here if you want to read it, especially you, Isa.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
really do.
amazing. Yep. So
Beautiful story.
it's set 100 years after the moon landing. So it's set in 2069. It is not set in Manila. It's set in Tarlac, which is where Gregorio Brillantes is from. And it's
That's my province. It's my
there you
dad's
go.
province. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
But
There you
I've
go.
rarely ever been.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I'm from
Shout out.
Bulacan, so sort of nearby.
Yeah.
Adjacent.
So adjacent. Yeah. So we've been talking about quiet science fiction. That's a quiet science fiction story. Basically, a father and his boys going to see the the expo about the moon landing in the Philippines, and the way it's described is a Philippines that hasn't changed or
yeah, they're heading
The
there,
world
riding
is the
about.
world has moved on.
Yeah.
Everything is so high tech except the Philippines.
except the Philippines.
Mhm.
So it's amazing. So yeah, so from that you can see that even when we write about the future, it's still about very much about the present.
That's right. Yeah. Eliza, you also wrote what, in my opinion, is the first
Oh,
modern long form science fiction novel, long form story.
yeah.
And can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's called Project 17 and it's
Yes.
about robots. um it's funny because when I think about the science fiction that I like, it's about things that are breaking apart, grimy sort of places,
Mhm.
rusty machines, that sort of thing, which in a way is still very much connected to our present reality, where things don't work as much as we
My
want.
internet.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
And it's funny because when I read articles about like retrospective about science fiction in the Philippines, I didn't realize that I was writing something new or something, that
You
hasn't
were.
been done, that hasn't been done in a while, because I guess it's just sort of reading a lot of American, or Anglo American science fiction, where I feel that we are sort of behind. So I guess that was my gauge. So when I started writing that story, I'm thinking this isn't anything new. But I guess for the Philippine context, it is a bit, yeah, it's a bit of an uncharted territory, so to
Yes,
speak.
of course.
Yeah, and it was
Uh,
very important to me to set it in the Philippines.
so just a quick commercial break before we go to Vida.
Yeah.
Actually, the earliest sci-fi in the Philippines were all mostly novels, serialized
Yes.
novels.
Ah,
As a matter of fact, the short stories that we write right now was actually rare until Brilliantes came along.
Yes.
There were hard. There was. It was actually Apollo Centennial was literally the first English science fiction short story.
Yeah.
Before
That
that, it
won the
was actually
Palanca,
all
by the way.
novels. Yeah.
Oh
wow.
yeah.
So
Yeah, it won the Palanca Award.
yeah. After the
Wow.
'60s, you were the only one who wrote something.
Isn't that
Oh
crazy?
dang.
It's sad. Yeah. It's
I
sad.
know.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
You'd
have
think there'd
a
be more.
I have a
Yeah.
quick thought on that, which is when I
Mm.
was in Ateneo, I kind of did a research project on publishing in the Philippines,
Mm,
and I emailed an editor from Anvil and basically
yeah.
asked this question of like, why are there no novels, broadly speaking, and then particularly
Yes.
speculative fiction novels um, being published? If you go to the Filipiniana section in the bookstore,
Yes.
how come it's all, if there is fiction, it's mostly short stories, but
Yeah.
there's very little fiction actually. And she actually emailed back and said there's no money in it, so people are
Yes.
really not incentivized to
Mm.
write fiction generally. And then short fiction is the thing that they teach in college and high
Yeah.
school if you're going to be a fiction writer. So like that, you already have that. Like that's what creative writing majors do. That's why you don't have
Mhm.
novels. And she did say like, majority of what we publish are either cookbooks or inspirational books because that's what sells, and we
Yeah.
need to think about that when we're publishing. um we didn't, I mean, YA was new then, but we didn't have like YA books either, for example. So I've always held that thought in mind, that there is a very real sort of like economic
Yes.
trade-off if you're an author to deciding to write a book when there's very little chance actually of it getting published, right? So there are disincentives to
Yes.
investing in it. This was true, I don't know, 12 years ago. I don't know if it has changed
Vida.
It's
much.
still
I,
true. I
as
Yes.
guess.
someone who used to work with Anvil earlier this year, it's
There you
still true.
go. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's even more competition now because what's big in the market, and let no one ever say that the Philippines is not a reading public,
Mm,
but what's big in the market are Wattpad novels.
Mhm.
And so us local writers who write in English have to compete with that kind of popularity. And I mean, I don't really want to get too much into this, but there's even more difficulty for authors to get noticed on the shelves, much less new ones,
yes.
because National Bookstore has a thing where books only have 3 months to hit their bestseller list, and if they don't hit the 3 months, they will be taken off the shelves.
Yeah, and if I can
Wow.
add, it is not unusual to walk into a Philippine bookstore and see um only titles from the US front and center. And
Yeah,
everything else from local authors are shoved into a corner under a shelf that says Filipiniana with no
yeah.
regard to genre or audience. You know,
Mhm.
they're just all there in one
Yeah.
shelf in a corner.
So if anyone in our audience was wondering why publish abroad, why not here, this is the answer.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I just oh sorry.
yeah. No, go ahead then. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share something that mentioned by Vice Prince Publishing Manager Nida Ramirez. She had a friend from Japan who was looking for local titles. And you know, in Japan, if you go to a bookstore, it's all their own stuff.
Mhm.
And so she was really shocked when she walked into, let's say, National Bookstore, and she couldn't. It was so hard to find our own books in National Bookstore. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
the sad
I'm gonna
reality.
add,
Yeah,
I'm
go
gonna add
on.
one more thing that's
Go.
exacerbating the problem. National Bookstore and Fully Booked have a rivalry,
Yeah.
and Fully Booked, and no, and Anvil, which is the biggest publishing house in the Philippines, got caught in between them in this rivalry. And so, if you'll notice, Fully Booked does not carry Anvil books where most authors publish, which hurts visibility all the more.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
have
and
Unexpected.
something. Yeah. Go
context,
ahead.
Anvil is a sister company to National Bookstore, so that's why
Yeah.
they got caught in between.
This is an aside. I'm actually very curious. I went home. I was home in January this year,
Mm.
and I went to National, and there were very few books. It was almost all stationery supplies. And
Mm.
then I was like, that's okay. This has been happening for a few years now. I'll go to Power Books. And when I went to Power Books, it was also all stationery supplies.
Okay.
And I was like, where are the books? I genuinely don't know where people buy books anymore. I mean, there's Fully Booked, but our bookstores are becoming stationery
Yeah.
stores. There's very
Yeah.
few books in them. Not just Filipino books, which they've never had a lot of, but even Western books. And it's the same titles I saw there 10 years ago, like Paulo Coelho. I
Mm.
don't know. I'm just like, why do we have like a whole shelf of The Alchemist and nothing else? Like,
Don't you
it's,
wonder, is it the same stock from 10 years ago too?
I think maybe.
Let me add my thoughts on this.
Yeah.
So the first time I got published in the Philippines was with Philippine Speculative Fiction Volume 6, and I'm not going to name the author, but I was actually asking for advice. If I wanted to get published, what should I do? And then I was told, well, since you live abroad, why don't you just publish abroad? Eventually, they will publish you here.
Ah.
And that
He's
was the
not
exact
wrong
words I was
though.
given. Huh? Huh?
He's not wrong though.
Mm.
Unfortunately, yes, he is not wrong. To give you an example, one of my favorite Filipino authors is actually now based in the United States, Eric Gamalinda.
Yeah.
He
Ooh.
had two books that were published, no, three in the Philippines, one on poetry, the lyrics of the dead language, and then two more. Uh, I forget right now. And they were published by New Day, and they appeared for a very short time and then they disappeared.
Mm.
But after he became published in the United States, suddenly his long form works were available in National Bookstore and in
Yeah.
Manila, where I
Ah,
spent probably 10 years trying to ask where are his books. And then
Yeah.
suddenly he got published in the US. Now he's available. So sad to say that is probably Filipino route to getting uh, popularly available in our bookstores. But the other thing I wanted to add here in Singapore, uh, they managed to avoid that. The two most largest book chains, MPH and Popular Bookstore, are exactly like National Bookstore. You walk
Mm.
in, slightly bigger section of books, but everything else is stationery or school
Mm.
books.
Mm.
So, but the readership in Singapore is huge because of independent bookstores, which I hope will flourish. In the provinces in the Philippines, they do. In Dumaguete, in Baguio,
Yeah.
in Bicol, there are independent bookstores. Shame on Manila. There are very few. They keep dying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they associated with writers that we don't want to get associated with, like a certain national artist who
Ow,
shall
the
not be
shade.
named. Yeah.
Mm,
So,
shade.
but I feel that if booksellers are allowed to actually sell books, there will be a much richer reading population in the
Mm.
Philippines, and that's the reality of it. Hopefully, less stationary. Yeah.
I
Anyway,
love stationery, but I was like, oh my God, this is all scissors and pad paper.
Okay, let's be honest. The stationery and National Book Fair isn't even that cute, okay?
Yeah,
yeah.
agree.
Sorry.
Vida,
So Victor, what was
I want to hear your
so
answer to the sci-fi question.
Okay.
oh talk-
Yeah. So interestingly, there is a stark difference between pre-PSF science fiction and post-PSF and after. I wrote an article called "A Short and Incomplete History of Filipino Science Fiction." You're all in it, by the way, just to let you know.
I
And
think
thank
that's
you.
where
you
I
can,
found out that was, like I was the first to publish a long form science fiction. Yeah,
yes,
okay.
in first modern one. Yeah, at
Yeah,
any
thank
rate,
you,
yeah.
Victor, for letting me know.
You definitely are. And the you can search it on my blog, vrocampo.com. Uh, the earlier science fiction was more in the Jules Verne type. So it was actually more science than the current one. The very first one, Dr. Satan by Mateo Cruz, published in 1946 by Victory Press. Ateneo and UP both have copies that's there, and I'm
Really?
hunting for a PDF version of this. Yeah, I found it there initially. I wasn't allowed
Wow.
to to read it very much. I just
Yeah.
took very quick stuff on it because it's very fragile. It's printed in almost newsprint. Yeah,
Oh my God.
but
Wow.
yeah, it tells the story about Filipino scientist, a doctor actually, a medical doctor who's also a scientist who finds a chemical that can extend human life.
Hmm.
So there is a very interesting difference in uh, point of view that the older science fiction works have that kind of like disappeared around the late 60s and the 70s. In the first ones, the Filipinos that were the protagonists were usually people of science or very science friendly. After that, what happened was majority of people were like victims somehow of science
Mm.
or they have to struggle. There's this distinct difference in point of view. You're not making science anymore. Science happens to you.
Yeah.
And that was
Mm.
why it's not bad. It's not something that, but I'm just curious to see what happened to us as a nation to
Mm.
have this big divide. So when printed work started becoming expensive, this was actually after the death of the Filipino comics. Comics and
Mm.
writing, science fiction and spec fiction are actually closely related in the
Mhm.
Philippines. The comic books actually evolved from chapter novels that were being published in the same publications like Liwayway.
Yeah.
They survived as comics like Darna, which is still very well known. It's like a Philippine Wonder Woman to people who are not from the Philippines. Then there are all the kaiju things that happened in the 60s about giant lizards, giant eagles that was
Yes.
popular also around that time. Um, but after that, when the comics folded, that's it. And it took a long, long time before PSF actually picked it up. By then, the Filipino psyche had changed, and
Mm.
since
Mm.
the type of stories that we wrote became simply different in this regard. I can't say worse or better because I mean they're two different writing styles and two different point of views. It's actually not helpful to compare them in that
Yeah.
regard. But I will say one thing: previous to the end of the 60s, Filipinos were writing science fiction in other languages, in other dialects and languages apart from English and Tagalog or Filipino.
Mhm.
Um,
That's cool.
Actually, before Project 17, the most
Mm.
recent long novel, apart from apart from one in the 80s, which was not a real writer, so I'm not gonna mention that, but it's in my article, was Tantaru.
I
Uh, yeah, which was published in Ilonggo
Mm.
in the
Amazing.
70s. Yeah. And I'm trying to find a copy of that because I would love to read it translated.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in its translated format. So that's my 2 cents worth for this. Incidentally, as Filipino science fiction writers, you are part of a tradition that is older than anyone else in Southeast Asia. Singapore
Oh.
started only in the 80s primarily. Indonesia a little longer. Thailand in the 70s. Uh, but we definitely have the longest published tradition of science fiction. Anyway,
Cool.
so before that, there are some questions here that I've been asked to tell you guys. Um, the most important one is, uh, except for Vida, the three of us are actually writing in the diaspora
Mm.
here. So there's a few questions related to this. Um, is there a difference at all from how we as diaspora look at the issues in the Philippines or treat science fiction or speculative fiction in general from how somebody like Vida, who's based in the Philippines, would? That is the first question. And the second question that's tied to this one is, has the diaspora in any way affected writing of speculative fiction in the Philippines? So this time, start with you, Vida.
what? What I'm
Yes, you're the only thorn among the roses here. So go.
okay there. Okay. So I've read a couple of stories from the diaspora as if that is like one homogenous thing, you know. And my thoughts are, yeah, there is a difference actually. For example, if you're a Filipino but you grew up in the US, but you still have you grew up with Filipino culture from via your parents, the stories tend to sound more American somehow. Um, I haven't quite pegged how that works exactly, but there is a very Western structure to the stories that I've read from the diaspora, and definitely word choices also clearly. Um, I also noticed that as far as my reading, um, diaspora science fiction from Filipinos tends to be a bit more positive, not cheery, but the outlook with regard to the future of the Philippines is way more positive than um, what we here in the Philippines are writing. I think it's because you are removed from, as Isa said, the daily violence that Filipinos are exposed to. So you have the ability and the time and the energy to think of a future where we're not affected by our myriad issues here in the Philippines. Um, early in my early 20s, I wrote my first and so far only science fiction story, and I tried not to address any current issues at the time. This was 2014, which is a lie because I ended up writing about Pluto, and it turns out that Pluto became an issue that year. But oh my God, don't write about current scientific issues because someone is going to debunk that, like, right. Anyway, it turned out to be a love story that had a solar punk sensibilities, and I did not talk about politics. I did not talk about poverty, but I did paint a world that still had echoes of it, that there was still violence. Like, I wrote a train crash in there somewhere. By the way, I seem to be prophetic because when I came back to the Philippines after writing that story, the MRT crashed along EDSA. So, oh my God.
Ouch.
Oh my God. Anyway, there. Um, I don't
Can we
know.
use you as a Death Note type person to?
No, no, no. Anyway, personally, I try to be more positive in my fiction. My rule for myself is always end in hope. That means that I end up with something bittersweet. But I I have rarely written a story that did not end in hope. And when it didn't, the one time it didn't, I was writing about, and this isn't even science fiction, I was writing about people in an island who were affected by a Category 5 storm. And this story did not end happily. Um, I think that may demonstrate if you're right here, living here, you're already too close to the issue and it's hard for you to think of a way out of it. So in some ways, I envy the diaspora writers a bit. There you go. There's my answer.
Isa, do you have something?
Yeah. I feel
Yeah, I
like
think as a
actually,
diaspora writer,
yeah.
as a diaspora writer specifically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like I said, I've been here 10 years now. And that's like that's a third of my life. Spoilers for my age. And it's definitely the kind of thing where when I go home, and I say home, I mean Manila. When I go home, I feel like a little bit out of place. Like I feel like I don't know Manila anymore. But there's some things that don't change, right? Like Mega Mall is still there. Comic Alley is still in the basement. My barkada is still there.
No.
Is it
Comic
gone
Alley's
na?
gone.
Comic Quest?
Yeah, the
Oh!
pandemic kind of killed
I
it.
have
Something
bad
changed.
news for you.
Oh my god, that's so sad. See, so some things change. And some things don't. Like my barkada, when I meet up with them, it's like we're the same kids who were in high school. I know that I've changed, right? And Manila has visibly changed too since 2010 when I left. Like I can just see, by feeling a little bit, and maybe this encompasses like how much of my own city I get to see between traffic and like not being able to. I mean, I know how to drive in the Philippines. I learned how to drive there, but I don't dare drive there because it's too scary, even if I drive very frequently in the States. It's like the malls got bigger, and then there's still all the poverty. Like that's kind of the visibility. And then there's like Korean idols all over the billboards, That's
Yeah.
that's what I observe. I love K-pop. So I feel like okay, that annoying thing that like people who live abroad say where you don't really quite fit. Because same thing in the States, right? Like I don't identify as Asian American, but I have lived here long enough that like I am really, really, really concerned about all the stuff that's happening in the States too. And sometimes when I'm being interviewed by like a foreign publication, they'll be like, "Oh, what do you think about X Asian American issue?" And I say, "Well, I'm not Asian American. Like I didn't have the the issues and the traumas that they had growing up. I grew up in the Philippines where we're all Filipino, so like
We're
the
all
like
traumatized.
we're
In a
traumatized in our
different
own
way.
way.
Yeah.
The microaggressions that you feel here being a Filipino as a child, right? Potentially, I didn't undergo. I mean, I have cousins who grew up here and they experienced more of that. But given recent stuff in the States, I have also had experiences where people say stuff to me on the street and I'm like, oh my God,
Oh my
that just
God.
happened. And I never had that experience growing up because everyone around me was Filipino before. So going back to like writing diaspora fiction, I think even now, even talking, I worry about my accent, for example. So that's one thing that's changed too. Like my family laughs when they hear me talking to coworkers because they're like, "Oh, you sound so American, worse, 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 worse." And I'm like, I can't hear it. Like I adjust to who I'm talking to, right? But that same embarrassment and a sense of guilt and like weirdness comes into my fiction too. When I'm writing about Manila, I wrote a story last year set in Makati, and I kind of was like, I think my Makati is like 2008. Like, I don't think it's accurate anymore. And I had to ask my barkada, like, hey, if you were going on a date with someone now, where would you go? Right? Like, I don't know anymore. I need to ask people. And I'm a little bit apologetic about it. But I also want to write a story set in Makati. You know, I don't want all my stories to only be set in California or New York now, right? So it's negotiating these things, even feeling a little bit of guilt around, like, I am now in the Western Hemisphere. I'm showing up early for this because I really want to, but most of the time it's flipped, and you guys have to wake up at really weird times or stay up really late to attend the sci-fi con, you know, to watch like a spec fic event in the West. And that's, you know, it's deeply unfair. Even like the award circuit, they only look at like very specific publications, very specific magazines, you know, certain editors. They just, it's like so narrow. And I know that because I come from abroad, but I have the privilege of being here and like engaging with the spec fic community in the States and in the UK, where I lived for a year, because I got to live in these places. So, you know, but my guilt doesn't really serve anyone, right? Like, what I want to do, if I have that privilege, is to uplift Filipino voices and, like, you know, try to steer people towards seeing that it's much more than that. And I think, you know, Vida, with her involvement in FireCon this year, did a lot more to that, right? Where you try to show the world it's not just the States and the UK, you know. So those are some of the thoughts in my head around diaspora.
Eliza.
It's funny that I'm characterized as diaspora because I'm here as a student and I got here only in 2018. So what I remember, it's not that long ago, you know, leaving the Philippines. And when I think of writing, I still think of setting it in the Philippines because that's still my, even if I'm living here, I don't see this as home yet. It's everything still feels temporary. So home is still the Philippines by, you know, despite everything that's happened. But I guess when thinking about the difference in poetics or identity between writers in the diaspora and writers in the Philippines, what I noticed, Isa raised the question of language. And I see this in your work and in Alisa Wong's work. You use a lot of code switching in dialogue, which when Filipinos write in English, everything is translated. Everyone speaks in perfect English, no code switching. And I'm thinking that's also a remnant of colonialism, that if you are going to write in English, you need to show up as a perfect English writer, you know? And whereas if you're writing if you're a Filipino writing in the United States, that is how you show your difference, and that is how you show your culture. So I don't know if Isa has something to add about that. Like, has anyone ever made a comment about the dialogue, the code switching in your story?
I have it all the time. I do not
I
have a
also
single
code.
story. Yeah. Do not
I've
have a
also
single
code switched
story.
again.
Yeah, where I do not code switch. As a matter of fact, for one of my favorite stories, Blessed Are the Hungry, I code switch 4 times for 4 different languages in
Awesome.
this thing. Yeah. I don't care, honestly,
Yeah.
for other people, because
And you shouldn't.
part of the one of the reasons here is that also I'm trying to share the experience of
Yes.
not understanding something. And
Yeah.
sometimes I deliberately make it so, and I tell them not to translate because I want them to feel that thing.
Yes.
Uh, I always make it so that you can intuit what something means without actually
Mm.
having to understand it. But I want to preserve that ability to be able to say something without actually telling the other person what you're communicating. And I think that's very important, because if you stick to the West everyone speaks in English, or even in places like Japan or China, where
Yes.
there's a very big literary community that's local, they don't experience this at all because everything's so monolithic, monolingual,
Yes.
and we actually have that capability to do this. In Blessed Are the Hungry, I did it in Spanish, Portuguese, Filipino, and English. So, but so meaning that there's a only 1 in 4 chances of you understanding the entire story. There's a problem for other people, but I don't think it's a problem. I think it's actually an opportunity to show
Yes.
how different things can be, and yet you still understand it. If you write it in a way that they can still get what you're trying to say or understand your
Yeah.
meaning, it's not
Yeah,
an issue for me.
I would love
Yeah.
to see more of it because I'm talking about our canon in Anglophone Philippine literature where everything there's no code switching at all. Like everything's just, in English.
So,
Yeah.
so I have one
I'm
question though.
probably
Go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
Vida.
I think Vida said.
no, sorry. I just want to add, I'm probably a weirdo because I've written several stories set in the Philippines now where I've code switched at a minimum of 3 languages. And I think I started doing this when I started trying to publish abroad. And like what Victor said, he writes it in such a way that people can intuit this. And I just want to say that context clues were one of my favorite English lessons in school, and we need to bring back how popular that is. Okay,
Yeah.
along with critical thinking. So that's how I don't know. I don't code switch a lot, though I do it in daily life. But I also want to show that I'm different in a way that even though that I live in the Philippines and but I'm a city girl from Manila, and most of us here are not very connected to our culture, whatever that is. And in some ways, this is how I do it.
Funny. I grew up in Quezon City my entire life, but because I spent a significant amount of time in the province, I don't actually have a single story that is set in Manila. Yeah,
Interesting.
What's your province?
half my
Victor?
it's not even my province. It's where I spent my summers that growing up in Quezon. So practically 3/4 of my stories that are set in the Philippines are set in Quezon.
Yeah.
My
There's
dad's family from Quezon too.
Yeah, I'm actually from two places, Batangas and Bulacan.
Yeah.
But
I'm from Bulacan.
I've only written one story set in Batangas. I've yet to write something in Bulacan. Everything is set in Quezon, where I spent my summers as a child. I have no story set in Manila at all. I should.
Wait,
Yeah, it's
why
interesting
were you
'cause,
going to Quezon if you're not from there?
Oh, we had a fish
for
pond.
vacation.
It was there.
Ah,
No. We had a fish pond, so I was exiled
okay.
there every summer, so I wouldn't get into trouble.
Sounds
Essentially,
fun.
the fish pond. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Bulacan, I grew up in Hagunoy, which has
I know where that is. Sagono. Yeah.
yeah. It's and the Tagalog there is very poetic.
Yes.
And my and I remember my father telling me why I'm not writing in Filipino. So
You should
yeah,
correct him and say, if I ever write something, I will write it in Tagalog.
yeah.
But Eliza, you write in both, right?
Yes, I do. This is strange because that's why I brought up the question of language as well. Because when I write English, short stories, novels, poetry, I have no problem imagining the dialogues. But when I started writing one act plays, which I wrote for Virgin Love Fest, which is a festival of one act plays that's staged in the Cultural Center of the Philippines, I can't imagine writing it in English. Because I started imagining actors on stage in front of me, and I'm thinking they have to be speaking in Tagalog. Like, there's no way to translate this experience. Yeah, so I'm still grappling with the language
No, actually, Eliza,
issue.
Elisa, if I were in your place, I'd write it in what I think I would be comfortable communicating. There are people who can translate for you anyway. If ever
Yeah.
it want to be done in English, I think if to you it sounds more natural in the vernacular, I would write in the vernacular.
Yeah.
I have tried, but I'm not very good. Sadly,
Same.
Mm,
Yeah.
I have
Isn't
tried.
that so interesting?
Yes.
No, it was my parents' decision to raise me speaking English to compete globally. So here I am.
But
Oh,
I share one thing with you. It's easier for me to write dialogue in Tagalog, in Filipino. But
yeah.
my Tagalog is much older than contemporary Filipino
Mm,
because
yeah.
the like Bulacan and Batangas
Yes.
to Tagalog provinces. So I have words I use, which I use in my sci-fi stories, which come from those that are not
Yeah.
in Filipino.
Yeah.
That's the
And
thing.
yeah, and that's something that if you speak to someone who grew up in Manila, like my husband, who was born and raised in the city, I have when I say some Tagalog words, he doesn't understand them. Like what do
Mm.
you mean? What's that?
Mhm.
So
The-
there are differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like deep Tagalog.
yeah.
No
No, but
Yeah.
there's
sleep.
also there's one very important thing that is hard to translate. Um, I tend to speak in Tagalog with an honorific to
Mm.
people who are not even older than me. I tend to
Mm.
be a lot more polite. So sometimes people look at me and say, "You're too polite,"
Mm.
and stuff like that. You tend to speak in plural. I tend to speak in plural
Yes.
in Tagalog, for example. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
that's it. It's I can't control it. It's how I was raised. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
I wish I could translate that into English without it sounding weird. Yeah, that's
I,
one
Mm.
thing.
I will
Yeah.
say on the code switching, it's interesting because now I'm thinking actually probably in my work you can see a bit of a break where I go from like the very clean English
Yes.
to more of the mix. And potentially that happened at Clarion where I
Mm.
had Nalo Hopkinson as a teacher and my class got into this whole debate about why are you italicizing Tagalog words in your
Mm.
story? And I was like, oh,
Hmm.
because we do that at home, right?
Yes.
And the
That's the
easiest
style.
example is, 'di ba, no sa atin
Yeah.
Yes.
is no is a Tagalog word, but it's spelled like no in English. So when you
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
to indicate the character saying no, then you have to italicize it. But here they say like, no, don't do that. That's othering, right? Um, which kind of goes into like colonial history and stuff.
Yes.
But I think after that class and that debate, I was kind of like, okay, to be honest, I don't really care. Like if the publisher wants to
Yeah.
italicize, fine. If they don't want to italicize, fine.
Yeah.
But I understand that it's a bit of a statement in the Western publishing hemisphere. And the use of Tagalog, I think honestly, after then was also partly because I missed it and because I
Mm.
wanted my characters to talk a little bit more like how I talk in real life. But it's not
Mm.
it's not accurate though. Um, and if you look at my body of work, it's very like selected. And I also realized because I'm revising now for my collection, very clearly marked by privilege. So
Mm.
in a couple of my stories, the manongs, the manangs,
Yes.
the like housekeepers will speak in Tagalog because,
Yeah.
and then largely in Tagalog, but then they'll also speak in English sometimes.
Yeah.
Whereas the like whatever the
The amo.
protagonist who's middle
The
upper
owner,
class will,
the employers.
yeah, the
Yes.
Yeah.
employers. I'm like,
The
what's the right word? They will be speaking more in English, right? Or
Yeah.
like if I'm writing, like high school girls, very similar to the private high school that I went to, they're gonna speak Taglish, but with very specific like Maarte Tagalog language,
Mm.
Um,
And it differs for private school too.
it's
Yeah.
different. Yeah, it's different between schools. And then sometimes I want to use a specific Tagalog phrase, but I know that the context won't be there if it's too short. So for example, I wanted a character to say "Sira ulo ako," which means like
Mm.
I'm
I'm
crazy,
I'm
crazy.
but
crazy.
Yeah.
but I wanted to have a different connotation to it. So I changed it to "My head is broken," which is a little bit more of a literal translation, even if it's not correct, right? So
Mm.
I'm trying to play with the language a little bit,
Yeah.
and a lot of it is unconscious, but it's neither accurate nor like really planned is how I
Yeah.
feel.
Sorry, I wanted to add, wow, this is a really meaty topic. I have a series of short stories that I write in journalistic form because I
Yeah.
used to be a journalist. And the journalistic stories here that are mostly written in English, when they have Tagalog phrases, they translate them in English anyway.
Yes.
Which, if you think about it, is weird because English is one of our national languages, but also maybe some people reading it are not. I don't know. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
But
and they
that's
would
Or
they would qualify. He said in Tagalog, and it
yeah.
says that it's very strange.
but
Yeah.
maybe because that's also the journalistic style.
It is. It
Usually,
is. But then I brought it to Clarion, to Nora Jemison, who was my teacher, and then she was like, "Why do you have to translate this?" But it was. I had no idea what to say other than this is how we do it
So
at
hard
home.
to compress hundreds of years of colonialism.
I know.
Now,
I only have
Sit
like
down.
6,000 words.
folks,
Yeah.
folks, we have 30 minutes and a ton of questions to go through that people have
Okay.
been sending.
Good.
Can we
Let's go.
I do one question and then we just go around to
Yeah.
answer?
Yeah.
Sure.
Fine.
Okay.
Okay. First thing that's here is what do you think about the new weird? Would you say that it's being written broadly, that it's a thing in the Philippines, or not so much? Okay, let's go. Who wants to go first?
I would
Eliza?
say for the new weird, go to Christine Ong Muslim. She's writing a lot of she has an interview up with Jeff Vandermeer on Weird Tales, I think, and there's also an excerpts from her collection. So that's just great.
Okay.
Isabel, any thoughts on that?
I have two fast
New
thoughts.
weird?
One is when I think of new weird, I do kind of associate that with Lovecraft, which I haven't read Lovecraft. I don't know if anyone here has. If they were
I
in
have.
National Bookstore, you
Me too,
have.
yeah.
I feel like I didn't access it, and I feel like so many new weird writers in abroad. That's sort of what they pull from. So, Eliza, have you written a Lovecraft story? Because I feel like it's remaking it, diba, usually.
I did, and
You
I
did?
wrote it exactly the opposite of how Lovecraft wrote. I really addressed the racist things that
Yeah.
are there. Amazingly, it is the first time my work has been published by a school in the Philippines, which was for Likaan in UP.
Wow.
Ateneo's never,
Awesome.
my own school has never published me, but UP's published me several times. The University of
Funny
Yeah.
because I think one of my weird stories also got published by Likaan. It's called The Seven.
Oh.
And I remember in the editorial notes they wanted like more of an explanation for the horror or the strange thing happening, and I'm like,
No, that's not how new weird works.
I was gonna say my second thought besides the Lovecraft thing. So I was like, if you're using that narrow definition, which I sometimes use, then I don't quite see so much of it, but I want to read your story now, Victor. But the second piece is I feel like all Filipino fiction is weird. So
That is so true.
It's not
I
new
have to
weird.
agree with that. In
We're
a
just
way,
all
all
weird.
Philippines is a
Filipino
weird
fiction
place.
has something related to the new weird in the broadest sense.
Yeah.
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 Vida?
Oh my God. Sorry. What was the question again?
The new weird.
What were your thoughts about the new weird in the Philippines? Is it a thing here? Is it being written about?
I don't think it's a scene here, but there's a new magazine called Ombak. They publish new weird from Southeast Asia. We have some
Wow,
Filipinos
I've
who've been
never heard of
published
that.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the best part is they pay 8 cents a word. That's USD.
Oh, good.
Anyway,
You gotta
Anyway,
message
so-
me the name of this later.
I will. Anyway, there have been 2 Filipino writers who've been published there. That's Joel Jacob Donato Ching and
Okay.
Sigrid Gallegos.
Wow,
And
okay,
Great.
yeah.
yeah, and personally, I write new weird when nobody is looking, and I am not brave enough to send it out there.
Said it.
I know.
Send it. Okay, sorry guys. Another
Go ahead.
question because we're running out of time. I'm thinking about what Vida said about not writing about current stuff, but I think it's impossible not to address COVID in the next few years. What are your thoughts on this? Since it's Vida, you start.
I actually have no problem about people writing about COVID because I watched a document no not a documentary I read an article a few weeks ago that said that in the 1918 pandemic of Spanish flu, there's actually not a lot of literature about that period anywhere. And the writer was asking if maybe it's because everyone was too traumatized by that time period, which makes a lot of
Possible.
sense. And I think now that we've got the internet and lots of other ways to document what's happening to us, it would be really cool. And it's already happening in the comic scene. There's a lot of comic
Yes.
anthologies, like with Andrew Drillon. He's in part of
Yes.
the, what's it called, Quarantales? I forgot.
Quarantine life,
Anyway.
I think. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. You know, people are making art about it, writing about it, and this is honestly a time in history that we should not forget about.
Mhm.
And
Agree.
if we have to document it through fiction, let's go.
Yeah.
Isa, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts? Have you written a story with COVID on it or pandemics?
No, I wrote a story during lockdown. It's the last story in my collection, and I'd been thinking about the story for a few years. But there's like a part when the characters are in high school, and then there's a part when they're like 30, mid 30s. And when they're in their mid 30s, I was like, oh, they've lived through COVID at that point, but I'm not gonna put it in the story because it would have just been a distraction from like the central drama. But I
Oh, that
think
makes
that's a
sense.
question. I think that's a question every writer needs to figure out. And like we're still living through it. Like this
Yes.
week has been like record cases in the States. And I think my county is gonna go on lockdown again very soon.
Oh
Um,
no.
Be careful.
yeah, I've been in lockdown since like March. I mean, I moved from Boston back to my parents' place in California, but we don't go out, you know. And so I'm just like, yeah, like this is it's current. So I think it's hard to write about it because we
Yeah.
don't know the outcome. But if people
Yeah.
want to engage with it, then like I think that's totally fair. I when I was writing that specific story, I just was like, I have no idea how this is going to play out. I'm not even going to try. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, I think.
What about you, Liza? You have any
Yeah.
plans?
So
Hmm?
so I write to make sense of things, and I feel like I still can't make sense of what's happening. You know, like I need more distance. Maybe eventually I'll be able to write one, but at this moment in time, I can't imagine writing about it. Yeah.
I actually wrote one story that was not a
Oh,
COVID story, but included a pandemic in it. For the Singapore Writers Festival this year, they actually published my first interactive story. So it's a
Oh
choose your
yeah.
own adventure type
oh
story,
no.
and
That's
the
awesome.
big portion of it happens during a time in the past, which is not us. It's actually 20, 2020 in the story, where the COVID is now vastly mutated. One in every four people dies, and people who go out have to
Whoa.
wear essentially a hazmat suit when you go there.
Ah.
So, but it's a critical part of the story because that's how some of the characters die. Yeah, but uh, it was my for me because I was also on lockdown just like everybody else, but I'm used to traveling. I'm used to going out. My day job as a tech person usually sent me everywhere. And I was really feeling very claustrophobic, very closed in by the whole pandemic. I just had to write it out how I was feeling. So
Mhm.
that was there. Yeah. I don't know if I'll write about it in the future because I think I worked out my issues in that story.
Fantastic.
Okay, guys,
Next
two
question.
questions that are related. Can you name three good authors or books for Filipino science fiction? And specifically, do you guys have any good examples for Filipino diaspora lit? Okay, who hasn't started? Eliza, you.
Huh. Oh, well, check out the PSF anthologies for sure.
Philippine speculative
Um,
fiction.
yes, Philippine
Yeah.
Speculative Fiction. Check out Alternative Alamat,
Mm-hmm.
edited by
Love that.
Paulo Chiquiamco. And yeah, there's so many anthologies. I don't want to mention my own stuff, but
Yeah,
yeah,
Eliza Victoria, Bottle of Storm Clouds. My
Very
first
nice.
introduction to her. There you go,
yeah.
first one.
Well,
Since
my,
you
my
don't want to
latest
mention,
novel is
there you
science
go.
fiction, so that's
Yeah.
something. Nightfall.
Plus Project
Yeah.
17, which we already
And
mentioned.
Project 17.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Isa?
For diaspora specifically, I mean, I always think about this anthology because it's right in the name. But you know, I mean, I think it's interesting now. You know, I think the Philippines has a privilege compared to some other countries because English is our second language, and so in a way, Filipino authors. I mean, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage because I think the result of that is we don't have a really strong lit tradition for ourselves, but you know, within us, like all the stuff we talked about earlier, compared to like Japan, all these other countries.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, I think we have a ton of authors. I think the anthologies are a great place to start for reading. And I think another thing I really appreciate about the Philippine spec fic scene is it's male, female, or even a little bit more female leaning
Yeah.
in terms of who's publishing, which is awesome.
You can tell it from the panel itself.
Yes.
Holding court, Victor.
The only rose among the thorns.
Yeah.
I say
And a lot of our writers also are editors, so you know you
Yes.
can see them choosing the stories that they like. So I mean, I'll leave it at that. I know, you know, I think the PSF series, which was a passion project for the Alfars, really sort of like encouraged the writing of Filipino spec fic, and I'm really excited for there to be more authors, and we'll see them more and more. I mean, I think recent years there's been a lot of publications, both in the Philippines
Vida?
and abroad.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks,
okay.
Isa.
Okay.
15-minute warning, that's why.
Right.
Oh,
I would like to promote Victor's short story collection, The Infinite Life
Yeah.
of
Thank
Other
you.
Stories. And I'm not just saying this because I copy edited it. It's excellent. Everyone should read. Eliza's Bottle of Storm Clouds and Isa's upcoming Never Have I Ever. Is that correct?
Mhm.
I am also trying to put a collection together. We'll see what happens next year. I've just been commissioning illustrations at this point. But I do have a self-published collection out, Beyond the Line of Trees. Sorry, it's self-promo. And it's all
Yeah.
fantasy. And I'm sorry if you're not into that, but that's what I write. And it's very Filipino and it's illustrated. Of course, the PSF anthologies and alternative alamat. And as to what else you can read, Filipinos generally the marker of coming of age here is releasing your own book of short stories for many economic reasons. So if you have a Filipino author that you like who is based in the Philippines, check out if they've got a short story collection. Most likely they will.
Yeah.
So,
Next question?
unfortunately, this is supposed to be Philippines and Singapore, but being the only lone person here in Singapore, and most of us being Filipino,
Oh.
I cannot do
Oops.
much justice to this. But Singapore just very quickly, for Singapore science fiction, there's a couple of really good authors out there. Ang Yisheng and Neon Yang are two of the best ones that are here. There's also Jason Eric Lundberg, who is not as a great author, but he's also the founding editor of Lontar, which is the only Southeast Asian anthology to have come out in the last 10 years. And interestingly, this book is heavily filled with Filipino authors.
Like
I
me and
think we
Victor in that issue.
Yeah, the two of us, both of us are actually in this particular volume, volume 10. I'm also Dean Alfar, who is basically the founding editor of Philippine science fiction. He's also here, and his wife Nikki is also a
I also have
fictionist.
stories in them.
Yeah, you have a story here too, right? So
Yeah.
Isay.
Oh, right.
Unfortunately,
Sorry.
yeah,
I'm
See, it's
exclusive.
for the Filipinos.
yeah, we're all Filipinos and we're here. Okay, so because we're running out of time, now is the time for self-promotion. Vida, you did it earlier, so you're last now. So Isa, you're the one with the upcoming book.
I have a question for you guys. Is PSF
okay,
still
go ahead.
ongoing?
This is an
PM.
interesting question.
You
That's
need,
a good
you
question.
need to PM. Or
This
they
is
had-
this is an interesting question because when I was working for Anvil for 6 months last year, the latest anthology landed in my lap. But I was not
Ah.
able to get to it because I had to leave that job after a couple of months.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened. But I told them to go ahead and start production.
Okay.
Out-
You know,
outside-
I'm like,
Mm.
I want our recommendations to be like for stuff that's also happening now. And I'm like, is it still ongoing? I know it started and stopped, but it is a really good one.
Unfortunately, we don't know. That's the real answer.
Amazingly, my arcs arrived like at 9
Yay!
p.m. yesterday.
Yay!
In time for the
Um,
panel.
It's
Me
nakakakilig.
one,
Can't translate kilig. So I'm copy editing it right now. And you know, this is coming out in February from Small Beer Press, which is really exciting and super, you know, a part of me is just like, I feel very grateful that I get to bring Filipino stories to an audience. My very first story has a manananggal, and I was like, yes, a manananggal. So, you know, it's available for pre-order online from any place. If you're based in the Philippines, you can order it from Book Depository, which ships anywhere, but that's Amazon. So I'd rather you give your money to an indie bookstore. I think if you order from Fully Booked special order, they should be able to because they use the same distributor. So
yes.
that's what I
Not
have
to
coming
mention,
out.
I think Book Depository kind of stopped shipping here for a bit because
Oh
of COVID.
really? Oh shoot.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm not sure if they started
no.
up again, but they did. Anyway, go ahead.
At some point next year, assuming COVID is less, I'll probably go home with like a maleta partially full. So if you know me, then just ping me. But we'll see. I don't know yet how easy it will be to travel. Also, because the States is like on fire. And then the last thing, I mean, in terms of stuff that I'm working on, I'm trying to work on a longer project, and I've been talking about this for like 6 years now. It's a retelling of Ibong Adarna.
This.
Yes,
That's great,
but
yeah.
gender flipped and queer and like very weird and pre-colonial, and so all of those things just make it like very hard to write. But I'm finally like at a point where, you know, I feel like it's going, so we'll see where that ends up.
Yeah.
Liza?
I already did some self promo earlier, but I'll just show again my book. My latest book that came out in 2018. It's called Nightfall. Just go to elizavictoria.com and you'll see a list there and information on how to get the books. Yeah, that's it.
Vida?
Okay, so I
Just flash your
completely
book
forgot.
cover for your flash your book
No,
cover.
this is the,
You can see.
I completely forgot to bring it out. Genius. Anyway, no, but I also want to promote other authors in the Philippines who are doing great work. See, Joel, who I mentioned earlier, has a new book out.
Yes.
His first book called Wing of the Locust with Scholastic Asia.
Yeah.
And it's queer. It's got a mambabarang and spy work in it. So please read it. What else?
Mang Babarang is a
Sigrid,
magician who does black magic.
yes, who works
Yes.
with insects.
Yeah.
Sigrid Gayangos recently won the Everything Change writing contest. She primarily, I think, I could be wrong, writes environmental science fiction and some really weird stuff, which is great. Oh, yeah, yes. Let's see what else. I'm not allowed to say it, but some of our local authors are going to be published in Strange Horizons in the coming months.
Yay.
Nikasha Silang, who was originally from the US and who has moved here, recently got published in Fireside for Body Remember. And once again, my short story collection.
There
There
you
you
go.
go.
Finally.
Yay.
I actually drew and painted the cover. There.
Nice.
This is
Amazing.
available on Gumroad as well. Anyway, although like still fundraising for flood victims, if you show me a screenshot of donating to a charity, I will send you the PDF version of this, because all the physical books, nearly all the physical books in existence, are in a box in my house. One more thing. I also have a novel work in progress. It is not set in the Philippines, but there will probably be Filipino sensibilities somehow. And I like to call it as child thief saves a magical library of Alexandria from a war.
Cool.
Libraries.
For me, bit of self-promotion. This is my book, The Infinite Library and
Yay.
Other Stories. You can get this from Books Actually. It is unfortunately I haven't been able to make the ebook available yet, but Books Actually delivers everywhere. So I don't know if it will go reach the Philippines though because of COVID, but everywhere else they probably deliver. I also have a novel in progress, which I stopped this year because after I did my interactive piece, I realized that I should stop being a pantser and be more of a planner. Yeah, big
Yeah.
and yeah. So I am in the middle of breaking it apart so I can more logically arrange the chapters. Hopefully, I should have it out uh, by before the end of next year. Oh God, crossing all the fingers. But we have now 5 minutes before the end of our talk, and I think we managed to cover almost everything. Maybe see before we get cut off, any tips, writing process type things that you want to tell people who want to write, Filipinos who want to write, or people who are starting with science fiction or speculative fiction. Who wants to go first?
I want Eliza's advice for how to finish a novel.
I'll go.
Me?
Eliza, you've been
Okay.
nominated.
I guess we don't have a lot of time yet, but I'll just say that when you end your work, end your writing day at a place where you can pick up easily the next day. Like don't
I agree.
like finish, yeah. So finish a section where you already know what happens next. So you'll feel confident the next day when you sit down and
Who wants to go next?
Oh, wait. Someone nominate someone.
Vida.
Vida, you're
Go Vida,
nominated.
go.
Okay. I take what I learned from journalism with me everywhere, which is the opening line of your story must have who, what, when, and where. And you could have a how and you could have a why, but I tend to have those answered by the succeeding paragraph or the rest of the story. And
Inverted
usually
clickbait.
yeah, so that's a trick for punchier openings.
Yeah.
Oh, and also I forgot, it hasn't quite been announced yet, but I am teaching a class on retellings with Clarion West in 2021. So stick around for that.
Yay.
Nice.
Yay. Isa?
My quick advice or my suggestion is to write Filipino stories. You are inevitably going to write Filipino stories because you're Filipino, if you're a Filipino writer listening to this. But I cannot understate how weird that idea was to me growing up, where I would write white characters or I would write Japanese characters because I loved anime so much. And until I was trying to submit to PSF, I don't think I ever considered writing Filipinos. So I know it's a bit strange because you don't read it often, but I would encourage younger Filipino authors listening to this, try setting your story in Manila or try writing about your family. It doesn't need to be foreign characters in order for it to be published. In fact, probably if you draw from your own experience, that will be more original.
Yeah.
Great advice. I have one practical piece of advice. When you're editing, don't edit on the same screen. I literally read it on another screen size or even on my phone because your mind tends to remember what you think you wrote. So it's easy to gloss over stuff. But if you change the size of the screen, or even like to a bigger monitor or to a smaller phone screen, it is actually easier to edit. It's much easier. Trust me on that one. Yeah. And then the second thing is for readers who want to read Filipino fiction, it is a bit hard to find our works, admittedly, compared to say Japanese or Chinese authors that are there because of all the translation. But it is well worth your time to find it. Filipinos do have a unique perspective on life that is surprisingly close to different to very different types of cultures, mostly because we are a syncretic culture, and you will probably find something of yourself or your culture in it. And it's, like I said, really worth the time for you to find us.
And there are many links on Victor's blog.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
discover a lot of the Filipino stories
Take
from
those
it. So.
down. And also the reason why it's so hard to find is because there are only 500 to 1,000 copies printed every time. So
Yeah.
That's true.
good luck.
But a lot of Filipinos now publish, thankfully, overseas short stories in particular. So you can find their work there. Practically every major American and UK publication, the biggest Chinese publication, science fiction world, they all have Filipinos. Yeah,
Mhm.
somewhere. Yeah,
It's thankful
Filipino
and it's
stories.
regretful
Yes.
at the same
Yeah.
time.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess we hit
We have.
9:30.
We still have a few minutes. What do
Oh,
you guys want
really?
to do?
It's
Yeah.
time. I think it's
I think
time.
it's time. It's
But we
time.
should
It's
say
time. Yeah.
this is thanks to
Really?
FutureCon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks,
again.
Mr.
Thank you for
Kao.
Thank
having
you to
me.
FutureCon and Future Talks for having us. For those who missed our talk, you can actually view it on the YouTube channel of FutureCon. This will be made available shortly after this. All right. I think that's it for us. 9:31. Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
You know, Victor, related to